Okay. Well, my name is Judy Brooks, and my great grandfather built his cabin up here in Grand Lake. And actually, he didn't build the cabin until 1903, but the family had land that they purchased in the late 1800s, and they'd fish on pitch tents and go fishing. And they would go fishing up in the park using their Model A's, Model T's, whatever, and horses in the early days on trails that, of course, now are only hikeable. But it started out as a fishing spot, and then in 1903 they built a one-room cabin, and then they built a sleeping porch around that. And my grandparents would come up on weekends and leave their 6 children with my great-grandmother in this one-room cabin with the sleeping porch, and my mother spent her summers up here with her grandmother. And they used to go hiking up to the Shadow Mountain Fire Station, but they would bushwhack it. There weren't organized trails then. And she learned to swim here in Grand Lake, in cold Grand Lake. And they just played. There weren't many activities, but they just made their own fun, 6 kids. And sometimes when it was bath day, she remembers her grandmother getting a big tub out, putting it on the floor of this cabin, and then when everybody had had their baths, she would just tip the bucket over, the tub over, and the water, of course, in those days in the cabin, it was strictly a summer cabin, would fall through the cracks in the floor, and she'd use the water to mop the floor and dispose of the water at the same time. And this, my mother's grandmother, my great-grandmother, loved to entertain people, even though this was a small cabin. And the cabin, it's not on the lake, this one, it is across in town, and it's built on the main road right across from what is now the bowling alley, but used to be Rustic Stables. And my brother currently owns the cabin, but I have memories of waking up and hearing the horses come in to Rustic Stables. You could hear their clip-clopping, and that was really a fond memory that I had. But that's where the cabin is. And so they actually, the main road did not go through at the time that cabin was built, and there weren't many properties or buildings around them, just the stable. And it was really quite an idyllic spot at the time, and they actually had a view of the lake where they were perched too, because it's kind of high up on a hill. And if you look today, it's a little tiny cabin by comparison between what is now the Terrace Inn and Spirit Lake Lodge. So that's where it is. And over the years, so many family members would come up and use the cabin, and my grandmother, it was passed along to her and after my grandfather died, and then she in the 70s decided she didn't want to maintain it anymore, so she sold it to my father. So it's been in with my father's family since then. And for a brief period of time, it was out of the family. It was sold to someone, and we were afraid they were going to tear it down, but they didn't. This person happened to love old homes, and he refurbished it beautifully. And later decided he wanted to sell, and so my brother bought it back. So it's back in the family. So it's been in the family really long term, over 100 years, that property. And now my brother has it. And when my father had it and we would come up as a family, I have 2 brothers, and families, as we all know, grow. And it got to be a little difficult to come up and use the cabin when you wanted to. So that's when my husband John and I started looking around for property here in Grand Lake. And so we bought our current cabin in 1991. And I believe this cabin now is about 100 years old. And it originally was built by the Bruin family, this cabin. And but it's had a few owners in between time. And it's a place that we're very fond of, that we love. And one of the former owners, who I believe was the Bullocks, built a lot of the furniture that's in this house. Then we have kept it because it's so has such character, and we really love it. And now our kids come up with their kids, so we have even added on to this house a bit to accommodate growing family as well. And both of our children, Jason and Juliana, were married here at the yacht club, and they both were active in sailing and still are. So that's kind of our family story. Grand Lake has always been a very, very special spot for all of us.
When you were a young girl coming up here, what kinds of things did you do?
Well, I would come up with my grandmother sometimes, and sometimes with an aunt and uncle, sometimes with my parents, but as a family we couldn't always come up as often, and sometimes not even every year, just because there were so many people who used the place. But mostly we would just hang out and play. I mean, there wasn't miniature golf or any of that at the time. And one memory I have especially is my cousin and I, when the current community house used to be a movie theater. And that was a memory I have that I first saw Rear Window with James Stewart in I think it was 1958 or something. And we had to walk home to the cabin after that movie, and we were scared to death. So that's a memory that I have of doing movies and just hanging out and playing, and we'd play cards. And my grandmother fished up until she was in her 80s. She was quite the fisherwoman. And sometimes we'd hike up with her up the inlets and go fishing with her. She would fish, but we wouldn't, and she was a fly fisherman. And every year she used to catch quite a few fish, and she would go to a private place too. I'm not sure where around here, a ranch, where the rancher would let her come in and fish, and she'd always catch her limit. And every year, she was from Boulder, she would have a fish fry in Boulder. And it's funny, she would clean all the fish and prepare them, but she never ate them because she didn't like fish. She didn't like to eat them. She just liked to catch them. So.
Did you ever do any fishing?
No, I didn't. No, John does all the time. He's quite a fly fisherman. So, but yeah, that's how the family really started up here. It was all because of fishing. They all wanted to come to the mountains and fish. And my great grandfather, as well as my grandparents, they were from Boulder, and in fact, my grandparents, both my grandfather and my grandmother, and their name was McIntosh, they were the county treasurers of Boulder for over a quarter of a century. First my grandfather, and then when he died, my grandmother took over.
So was it your great-grandparents that migrated to the United States?
Actually, on my father's side, the Garberinos, that family, we were the first Italian family on record to settle permanently in Colorado, and there were 5 Garbarino brothers who immigrated from Italy to here. But the cabin, my great-grandparents who built the cabin here in Grand Lake, they were my maternal great-grandparents. And
now, even when you were growing up here, was it just a one room with the sweeping porch?
Yeah. No heat.
No heat. Well, kind of describe the interior. I mean, did it have indoor plumbing?
No, we had an outhouse, and we did have one sink with running water, and it was cold water, of course. And I remember my grandmother always had a ladle, a little tin ladle for drinking. It had a long handle on it, and that was always your drinking cup. And we had a wood stove that is still there. It's more decorative now, but my mother, my grandparents, they all used to use it for cooking. But it had a wood stove in the room and a table, and then the sleeping porch was nothing but beds, and there were no windows. It was all screened in, and there was canvas that you would cover the windows with, kind of on a frame. And that's when, if I'd hear the horses coming to rustic stables, I'd lift up the canvas so that I could watch them come in. But it was a tiny place, but lots of people would stay there. We just kind of crowded in, and I think sometimes people pitched tents on the property. And I remember one time my great-grandmother, who loved to entertain, she bragged about a time when she had 20 guests there, and they all slept actually in the cabin itself, but that was in the days when you could remove the seats from the cars, and they would remove the seats from the cars and bring them in, and it would be literally wall-to-wall bedding for all those people. And she'd kick them out then in the morning to fix breakfast. But that's how we heated the cabin at that time. I don't think they made a lot of changes over the years until my father had it in the 70s, and then he added heat. But it was always just the wood stove that was the source of heat. And my grandmother would get up early in the morning and get the stove going to kind of heat up the cabin.
What did people sleep on the sleeping porch?
There were beds, but you know, they were the old metal beds with the metal springs. And it would be very cold, and I remember quilts were the thing then. And you would sleep with a whole pile of these heavy quilts on you, and your nose would be, you'd just be freezing. Because I remember it as being a lot colder then, and crisper weather and more the smell of pine than, and the weather is different here. It's certainly gotten warmer and of course more developed, a lot different today.
So is it still just one room and the sleeping porch?
It has been it's still basically that as the footprint. Yeah, nothing has been added on to it, but it's been gutted and kind of redone. The kitchen area, it's still one big room, and then the sleeping porch is no longer screened. It's been walled in, and so it's more comfortable. And actually, I think my brother sometimes will use it in the winter time too. But yeah, it's a lot, basically the same configuration as it was, just a little more finished, and of course there's heat now, and running water, hot and cold, and a bathroom.
That's nice, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
So you grew up with an outhouse?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And this was up until...
Oh, well, believe it or not, up until 1985, my dad wasn't able to tap into the sewer until 1985.
What about electricity? Did you always have it?
Yeah, they always had electricity, but it was really old. I remember when they first went to refurbish the house, and the electrician, he wanted to collect some of the stuff from the fuse box. He'd never seen anything like that before. So it was old, very old stuff. And I remember when I'd come up with my grandmother, we'd go and we'd get some coal for the stove, and we'd go, and it seems to me it was in an area near where the Crabtree Realty office is now. I may be mistaken, but we'd go there for a big block of ice for the ice box. I mean, and when my grandmother had it, it was an ice box, not a refrigerator, that we would use. And those are my memories of when we come up. Those were the two things you had to do.